Hello, and welcome to this Community Health Worker training on Human Trafficking 201. This training is part of a training called Recognizing and Responding to Human Trafficking in a Healthcare Context that was presented by the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And if you have any questions during or after this presentation, you can contact the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline at 1-888-373-7888. So my name is Julie St. John, and I'm a Texas Certified Community Health Worker Instructor with decades of experience in community health worker training and in human trafficking. This presentation will enable community health workers and other healthcare professionals to define human trafficking and to recognize how victims or survivors may come into contact with healthcare professionals, community health workers, or promotores, and to identify potential human trafficking victims and how to apply promising practices for assisting a person or a patient, a community member who may be a victim of human trafficking or a survivor of human trafficking. We will begin this training by reviewing the federal definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking became a federal crime in 2000 with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. The TVPA defines human trafficking as a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purposes of either compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Victims can be anyone: men, women, children, adults, citizens, non-citizens. Sex trafficking then is divided into two distinct subcategories. You have adult sex trafficking and child sex trafficking. So under the law, an adult is sex trafficked when they are induced to perform commercial sex by means of force, fraud, or coercion. However, when a person is younger than 18 years of age and they're induced to perform a commercial sex act, it's a crime regardless of whether there's any force, fraud, or coercion. This is distinct from labor trafficking cases. In cases involving both adults and children, traffickers must have used force, fraud, or coercion to compel the victim to provide labor or services. So this definition is not the criminal definition, but rather a general definition as recognized in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. For more information on trafficking criminal offenses, you can review the U.S. Code, Title 18, Part 1, Chapter 77. The A&P model, or the Action Means Purpose model, can be used to describe the elements of human trafficking. Cases that are considered human trafficking involve three elements: action, which is recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining an individual. These are actions that constitute sex trafficking but not labor trafficking, and they can include patronizing, soliciting, and advertising an individual. Through M, means, for force, fraud, or coercion. For specific, P, purpose, compelled labor services or commercial sex acts. Examples of force include physical abuse or assault, sexual abuse or assault, or confinement. Examples of fraud include false promises of work or living conditions or withholding promised wages. Coercion may include threats of human harm to self or others, debt bondage, psychological manipulation, or document confiscation. However, it is important to remember that it is not necessary to demonstrate force, fraud, or coercion in sex trafficking cases involving children under the age of 18. So where does human trafficking occur? Well, human trafficking occurs in a number of venues and sectors. Sex trafficking may occur at venues such as commercial front brothels, hotels, motels, online, or on the streets, among other places. Labor trafficking may occur in sectors such as domestic work, traveling sales crews, restaurants, food services, or agriculture. It's important to note that human trafficking may also occur in lesser known locations or less frequently reported venues such as construction, bars, clubs, and manufacturing. A victim who has experienced trafficking in any of these venues may have cause to seek medical attention. For more information about human trafficking in any of these networks, you can visit www.traffickingresourcecenter.org.
Hello, my name is Kelly White. I'm a family nurse practitioner. I've been in medicine for about 20 years now, and I am very well versed in all aspects of healthcare, from beginning to end of life. I've also been involved in human trafficking education and intervention, especially in healthcare, for the last probably 8 or 9 years now. So I'm going to touch briefly on what trafficking in healthcare can look like and kind of some of the things that those of us that are involved in healthcare should take a look at and pay more attention to, so we can be aware of some of the signs of what that can be like, so we can better participate in getting those victims better access to services. So victims of human trafficking may have varied experiences and access to healthcare services. Some victims are able to regularly access health services. Others may have been denied very much needed medical care by their trafficker or by their keeper, or they're only allowed to seek medical assistance under the careful watch of their trafficker. So those are things that you're going to need to keep in mind. Studies have shown that the healthcare system is often one of the most frequently accessed services by human trafficking victims. So we have a very open door for them. So we may be one of the first ones to have contact with them outside of the people that they see on a regular basis, whether that's their trafficker or the people that they're forced to be exposed to. One study did show that 87.8% of trafficking survivors reported accessing healthcare services during their trafficking situations. And then of that percentage, 68.3% were seen in an emergency department. In another study, Lauren, a survivor of trafficking, shared in an interview that during the time she was on the street, she went to hospitals, urgent care clinics, women's health clinics, private doctors, and no one ever asked her anything anytime she ever went to a clinic. So no one ever took a good health history on her to see what her living situation was like outside of those visits. And that's a good reason why medical professionals in any setting have a critical opportunity for identifying and connecting patients to those services. Many survivors and victims of human trafficking will experience ongoing medical concerns stemming from or exacerbated by their trafficking situation. They may need treatment for physical health, mental health, addictions. Seeking help for those needs will place the trafficking victims in direct contact with healthcare professionals. Needs of trafficking victims could include anything from treatment for injuries, so things like fractures, musculoskeletal problems, so basic back pain, neck pain, jaw pain, oftentimes because they've been beaten, frequent nosebleeds because they're being forced to snort drugs. They may have infections on their arms, impetigo, common skin infections. Those are things that we need to be on the lookout for. Illnesses, salmonella poisoning because they're drinking nasty water, pesticide poisoning, certainly infections such as STIs, UTIs, and then obviously treatment for depression, anxiety, PTSD. Be on the lookout for things like sleep disorders or sleep deprivation, insomnia, night terrors. I always question my anxiety and depression patients for things like night terrors, sleepwalking. Those are good indication that something serious is going on. Night terrors and sleepwalking are not things that adults should be doing. Those are common, more common in children that have other underlying issues, but should certainly be something that a child would outgrow. So if you have an adult that are experiencing those issues, there's probably something else going on. They may need assistance accessing basic needs for things like food, hygiene, obviously gynecologic care during and or after their pregnancy, pregnancy tests, abortions, if you're working closely with an abortion clinic, and or aftercare for abortions. Kind of pay attention to those women that you see frequently. Those could be cries for help that they are using that as a form of contraception as opposed to being able to access good women's health care. Medical treatment for substance use disorders could be another thing. Trafficking victims oftentimes will use or will be addicted to a substance in order to keep them compliant. Trafficking victims may also access health services for pre-existing conditions or medical concerns that are unrelated to their trafficking situation. If patients or potential trafficking victims are not from the United States, it's really important for a health professional to screen for any pre-existing conditions that are common in their countries of origin. So be sure to kind of keep those things in mind as well. While many victims of trafficking have access to healthcare services, rarely do victims self-identify to medical professionals. And there may be reasons why a victim of trafficking doesn't feel comfortable disclosing their situation in a clinical setting. By understanding the barriers to both accessing medical treatment and victim self-identification, healthcare providers can better meet their needs. While each person has a unique experience, here's some common reasons why trafficking victims may not self-disclose to health professionals. So that person may have shame or guilt. Patients may not volunteer information about their situation to their healthcare provider because they're ashamed or they fear being judged. They may have a sense of shame for their situation. They may fear retaliation by their attacker. Oftentimes, those people are not being left alone in the room. So they feel like if they say something that is out of line, they're going to be retaliated against when they get out of that situation. Their trafficker is going to lash out at them. Traffickers will often use extremely coercive methods to compel a victim to stay in the trafficking situation. Oftentimes, that can look like threats of harm to their self, to their coworkers, peers, oftentimes loved ones, especially if they have a young sibling. They'll threaten that young sibling, their family, especially if that victim should try to reach out for assistance. They may have a fear of arrest or deportation if they're here illegally, or they've been told that they're here illegally, even if they've done all the things, or their trafficker has done all the things to get them here legally. They may have their specific legal documentation being held from them, so they don't know that they are here with the opportunity to have options given to them. They think they're going to be deported. Victims, both foreign nationals and citizens, may have been made to believe that if they attempt to seek assistance or report that they're traffickers, that they're just going to be arrested or deported. Lack of transportation or controlled movement. Oftentimes, victims of trafficking may not be able to access health services due to confinement to their workplace, lack of transportation or isolation. So oftentimes, you have to keep in mind that this person may be held captive in a certain place. They may not be allowed to leave, or if they are allowed to leave, the only people that can transport them are those that are keeping them in that situation. They don't have access to transportation. Other victims are able to seek medical treatment, but oftentimes they're accompanied by their trafficker. And that trafficker may or may not even be a family member. So think about familial trafficking. That person may be a parent. That person may be an aunt or uncle. And so even though that person is a family member, they are accompanying them, but that person is also their captor. They may have a fear of report to social services, especially if that victim is a minor. The parent may be hesitant to seek assistance from a medical provider because they're concerned that disclosing anything would necessitate a report to social services. Victims who may have been lied to by their trafficker about the social service system in the U.S., or they've had prior negative experiences while in care, they may avoid accessing medical services or reporting their trafficking situation. So any lack of understanding of our healthcare system will further their misconceptions about our healthcare system. There may be concerns about insurance, cost, that may preclude a victim from accessing medical services or self-identifying to a provider. And oftentimes, something else you should keep in mind is that, like many other things that we as healthcare providers deal with on a regular basis, they may not self-identify as a victim. They may not see themselves in that role. So just being able to ask the right questions is incredibly important. It's important to note that some victims may have a lack of self-perception. So all of those things can culminate into them not being aware of what's actually happening. So many health professionals may be in a very unique situation to recognize and help these trafficking victims. These would include anyone from physicians, nurses, lab techs, discharge planners even. We all play a crucial role in identifying victims of trafficking and offering services. Victims of trafficking may come into contact with healthcare systems from a variety of access points. Absolutely anyone involved in the healthcare setting could be in a position to recognize victims of human trafficking. It's incredibly important that training on human trafficking be offered to all staff within a medical facility. That can include ambulatory care staff, emergency department, even administration, billing, customer service staff. If you think about it even from a billing standpoint, If you're the person that's inputting those charges, or you're inputting that information and you see the same things coming up over and over and over, or you see that person that has really weird fractures, or that person has really strange recurrent infections or recurrent injuries, and you're like, this doesn't add up. Speak up. You may be seeing something that truly is a red flag. Physicians and services, especially primary care specialists, emergency, OB-GYNs, nursing staff, social workers, case managements, discharge planners, absolutely sexual assault response team nurses, forensic nurse examiners, therapists, both occupational and physical therapists, mental health therapists, dental offices, psychiatric care providers, obviously substance use disorder treatment programs, plastic surgeons, ophthalmologists. The list just goes on and on and on. We all have a duty to recognize these patients, because absolutely any one of us at any given time could be exposed to someone that may be in a position for one of us to reach out and help them. So while each individual's experience is unique, the indicators listed in the next few slides are going to include some red flags that are frequently present in labor and sex trafficking situations that have been reported to the NHTRC. If you find that several of these red flags are present for a patient with whom you're working, we do recommend you engage them in a safe, victim-centered conversation about human trafficking. General indicators of labor trafficking can include things like workplace restriction and abuse. They may have been abused at work, threatened with harm by an employer or a supervisor. Maybe they're not allowed to take adequate breaks. Maybe they're not allowed to use PPE, so proper protective equipment. Maybe they have debt bondage, or so a debt that is too large to ever pay off. So maybe they're told, we're going to take you from point A to point B. You're going to pay me X amount of dollars, and then you're free to go. But by the time they get there, they pay X amount of dollars, and that person says, well, the time it took you to pay that, you've accrued this much money worth of food and clothing and etc. And as they continue to pay that off, they've continued to accrue debt. And so there's this never-ending cycle of accruing debt. And so they're never going to break that cycle. And it continues to evolve and expand. Document confiscation, so that person's personal identification documents have been taken from them. That could include anything from their driver's license, passports, visas. All of those things have been held intentionally by their trafficker. That's something that if you're working, especially in emergency department, if you notice that when you ask for that person's identification papers, someone other than the person that you're speaking with provides that document to you, that could be a red flag. They're not in possession of their own documents. Recruitment fraud. I have seen this happen specifically recently, probably more often than I would like to think happens. So victims of trafficking may be compelled to do different jobs under different conditions or for different pay than they were originally agreed upon during recruitment. So they're told, this is going to be the job, this is what you're going to do, I'm going to pay for you to get from point A to point B, and this is going to be the job. And then they get here and it's absolutely nothing like what they were told. The work conditions are terrible, the pay is zilch, they're having to pay, or they're having to work for their keep, and or worse conditions. So oftentimes it ends up being very, very difficult for them to even be able to pay back, simply because they're never able to work enough to pay back that debt. So this list that I've provided, they're not exhaustive, but when they are present alone, they might not necessarily indicate trafficking. However, it is important to recognize these signs so that you can better respond to and help patients in potential trafficking situations. Patients who are victims of labor trafficking may also present with various physical and behavioral symptoms. These symptoms may be directly caused by physical or sexual assault perpetrated by a trafficker, or show that the patient is repeatedly engaging in labor in an unsafe work environment. Patients who are victims of labor trafficking may present with various musculoskeletal and ergonomic injuries. So think about some of those injuries that people may present with just because they don't have safe working conditions, or they're not able to use safe body mechanics. Some labor trafficking victims may not even be allowed to stop work, so they don't get an opportunity to rest, even for 5 minutes, go to the restroom, eat, drink. They may present with malnutrition, dehydration. Traffickers may even prevent access to routine health screenings, so they're not able to take care of themselves adequately. They may not be able to access medical care for any existing illnesses, injuries, and so even their baseline underlying medical conditions may not be getting appropriate treatment. So think about if you have someone who has underlying diabetes and they are never able to take a break from their labor. They're not able to sit down and rest. That person may develop complications with their feet. We know that diabetics have problems with their feet. And so this can turn into a very, very difficult situation very quickly. And because of this, patients may present with signs that injuries have gone untreated for very long periods of time. They may have, as I said earlier, skin infections. That's a pretty big one. If you have someone that, especially an adult, that has just really random skin infections on their arms, most of us are able to at least wash appropriately to where typical skin conditions that often we would see on a child because they don't stop playing long enough to wash their hands and arms. That's a red flag. Poor dental hygiene or injuries from things like chemicals, pesticides exposure. Most of your chemical and pesticide companies nowadays, they wear appropriate PPE even when they come over just to spray your house or something like that. So that's something that you can consider. Some labor trafficking victims, especially those who work in sweatshops or are forced to work in poor lighting, that can cause things like severe eye strain, ophthalmology issues. So that's why our ophthalmologists and those that work in eye care centers should be on the lookout for those issues. Labor trafficking victims may present with somatization symptoms that result from experiencing large amounts of daily stress, such as recurring headaches, abdominal pain. Behaviorally, patients who may be victims of labor trafficking may seem anxious during examinations and could even have panic attacks. This sometimes can be due to the level of coercion that the traffickers have applied to them. They may give conflicting stories when asked about how they got their injuries. They may exhibit unusual or paranoid behavior, particularly in regard to their employers. Patients may also present with symptoms of affect dysregulation due to the trauma they experienced as a trafficking victim. That can manifest as mood swings, anger outbursts, aggressive behavior. If accompanied by a trafficker, the patient may not be allowed to speak for his or herself. The trafficker may insist on speaking on behalf of the patient or interpreting for the patient. So you may have someone that they say, oh, they don't speak good English, I'm going to interpret for them. That may or may not be the truth. So it is important to note that each indicator below, taken individually, may not imply a potential trafficking situation. Neither are indicators intended to be cumulative. These are just simply red flags. And again, the situation should be assessed as a whole to determine if trafficking is truly occurring. Okay, I'm going to review some case studies here with you guys real quick. So let's take a moment to read the following case study. Chanda comes to the ER with severe stomach pain. A man identifies himself as Chanda's brother-in-law and offers to translate for her. He explains that although she has had stomach problems recently, she has not been to a doctor because she doesn't have insurance, so that so far makes sense, right? But Chanda doesn't make eye contact with the staff and her brother-in-law. A nurse explains to Chanda's brother-in-law that she needs to examine each patient privately, and the brother-in-law says something harshly to Chanda in Hindi. So now we know that this patient is of a different culture and a different race. Also, we probably know that because of this, she may or may not be allowed to be examined without the presence of a family member. Through the interpreter, Chanda informs the nurse she helps clean her brother-in-law's house and provide childcare. While she loves him and his children, Chanda is stressed because she works 12 hours every day. He supervises all of her phone calls and scrutinizes every phone bill. Hospital staff diagnose Chanda with a stomach ulcer and write her a prescription. Obviously troubled, Chanda says she's been to another ER before and had the same diagnosis. She stopped taking the medicine because she had trouble saving enough money to pay for the medication, and she is unable to go to a pharmacy without her brother-in-law's assistance. So here we're going to wonder what potential questions could have been asked of Chanda to determine if this is a human trafficking situation. So stomach ulcers are often exacerbated by stress. We know that. And we could ask her, or we could say something along the lines of, you seem to work a lot of hours. Are you able to take any days off? Do you get out of the house to do something for yourself? Do you get some sunshine? Do you get any exposure to the outside world? Do you get to go walk around the store? Anything at all? And then why or why not? Are you able to take adequate breaks, eat, get plenty of sleep every day when you're working for the family? If you wanted to stop working for your brother-in-law to get a different job, would you be able to leave? Is there someone else who can help you access healthcare services when needed? Why does your brother-in-law prevent you from getting care? And then maybe even, depending on how it's going, say something along the lines of, your brother-in-law seemed to speak pretty harshly with you earlier. Does he always speak to you that way? Has he ever harmed or threatened you? And then kind of notice that the questions are relatively neutral, not accusatory, so it's easier to establish trust with the patient. It's also important to note that healthcare providers should let potential trafficking victims know of any mandatory reporting obligations before questioning the individual. Okay, so we've covered labor trafficking. Let's jump into some general indicators of sex trafficking. Those may include evidence of controlling or dominating relationships, signs of physical and or sexual abuse, signs of drug or alcohol use or misuse, inappropriate dress for weather or situation, a minor under the age of 18 who is providing commercial sex acts, lack of control of his or her money and finances. Again, these indicators are not exhaustive, and when present alone might not indicate trafficking. However, it is important to recognize these signs so that you can better respond to and help minors in potential trafficking situations. So as with labor trafficking, when it comes to the hesitations about reporting, the same things can be considered for sex trafficking. Victims might be hesitant, and it may even more so just because of the nature of sex trafficking. It's a little bit more intimate, and could even be considered a bit more difficult depending on the person to stand up and speak about. They may be hesitant to share information about their involvement in the commercial sex industry with their healthcare provider. They're ashamed. They have a fear of being judged. Medical providers may notice that there are some signs that the patient would display that could indicate sexual assault or involvement in the commercial sex industry. That could include multiple or recurrent sexually transmitted infections, an unusually high number of sexual partners, particularly for younger patients, any trauma to the vagina and or the rectum. If you see a patient that has an impacted tampon in the vagina, that's often used to prevent buyers from knowing that they're menstruating. Chronic complaints and somatization symptoms indicating large amounts of daily stress, such as recurring headaches, abdominal pain, etc. Any suspicious tattoos or branding, such as something that says daddy or property of, that are suggestive of sexual exploitation. I know that sounds silly, but you would be surprised how many times those things are found. It may not be that blatant. You may see a patient that has a tattoo that's a crown that has a man's name on it. And for a young individual, that would be strange. You may see that she has initials tattooed on her behind her ear or on the back of her neck or somewhere that's inconspicuous. That could be labeling. That could mean that she belongs to someone. So all things to look out for. Potential trafficking victims may present with the following behavioral symptoms. They may exhibit a depressed mood and or a flat affect in their demeanor. They may have high levels of anxiety. They may be hypervigilant, paranoid, have frequent panic attacks. They may display affect dysregulation symptoms such as irritability, mood swings, anger outbursts, aggressive behavior. They could have a long history of frequent emergency care visits, similar to what is seen in cases of domestic violence or abuse. They may also have an inability to explain why and how they sustain their injuries. They may have conflicting explanations for those injuries. They could also have answers that don't align with those physical symptoms. So be sure that the explanation fits the situation. They could have use of slang terms such as daddy, referencing to a boyfriend or a non-relative. They could talk about the life or other terms related to commercial sex, signs of drug or alcohol abuse. And then again, each red flag taken individually may not imply a potential trafficking situation. Neither are red flags intended to be cumulative. For adult patient, engagement in commercial sex alone does not indicate a person is a victim of sex trafficking. Remember, sometimes being involved in the sex industry is a choice, and for an adult, that could be their job of choice. So that may not always indicate that a person is a victim of sex trafficking. So these are simply red flags. The situation should be assessed as a whole to determine if trafficking is indeed occurring. However, child sex trafficking, as we all know, is never by choice. A child certainly cannot consent to sex of any kind. So while many of the physical and behavioral indicators for child sex trafficking are the same as adults, some are going to be unique only to children. These are going to include things like pregnancy or abortions at an unusually early age, early sexual initiation, signs of trauma to the vagina and or rectal areas, symptoms of STIs or UTIs at an early developmental age, an unusual number of sexual partners for someone their age, suspicious tattoos or branding. Children may also exhibit several behavioral indications that they are victims of sex trafficking. These can include things like a history of repeatedly running away from home or foster care placements, reports that they're not attending school, or maybe even that they're frequently absent from school, maybe highly sexualized behavior or dress. They even could start bringing jewelry or purses or accessories that are certainly too flagrant for a child their age or inappropriate for the amount of income that people know their parents are making. They could demonstrate angry or aggressive behavior with staff. They exhibit a depressed mood and or a flat affect in their demeanor, signs of drug or alcohol abuse. Also remember that if a patient under the age of 18 is engaging in commercial sex, that's not necessary to identify. It is not necessary to identify signs of force, fraud, or coercion in order to determine a case of human trafficking under federal law. That child is under the age of 18. Okay, so that's going to be, you don't have to identify signs. That in and of itself is going to be against the law. Okay, so taking what we've learned into consideration up to this point, let's go over the following case study. So Jasmine comes to a clinic for an HIV screening. Although her intake paperwork says she's 19, the nurse observes that developmentally she seems far younger. Jasmine tells the nurse she's mature for her age and very experienced. She also has a tattoo of the name Lil G on one arm. During the exam, she constantly receives texts and calls to her cell phone. She answers the phone and says, "Daddy, don't worry, I'll be done soon." She tells the nurse that her boyfriend, who is 30, is so in love he can't be far away from her for even 1 minute. The screening results indicate that although Jasmine is HIV negative, she has multiple other STIs. The nurse asks Jasmine whether she uses protection during sex, but Jasmine shrugs and says sometimes they don't want to. When the nurse asks who they are, Jasmine says that sometimes she has sex with other men, but won't say how many. She says she won't be in the life forever, just until she and her boyfriend can save up some cash. So definitely some pretty big red flags here. So the nurse believes that Jasmine is younger than she says she is due to her physical development, the discrepancy between her reported age and her education level. So why do you think a patient would lie about her age? So it is possible that her trafficker, presenting as her boyfriend, has given her a canned story to protect him from liability. The patient may also lie to avoid trigger mandatory reporting. So keep those things in mind. Now, is Jasmine a potential victim of human trafficking? Why or why not? Remember, force, fraud, and coercion are not necessary to prove trafficking for minors in commercial sex. If she is in fact a minor and involved in commercial sex, she should be considered a victim of human trafficking. To engage Jasmine in a conversation about her potential involvement in commercial sex and potential exploitation by a trafficker, I'm going to give you a few questions that the healthcare provider could adapt for her conversation with Jasmine. Have you engaged in sexual acts with someone in exchange for favors, money, or goods? Do you know if your boyfriend or someone else has ever received something in exchange for a sexual act with you? Has anyone threatened to hurt you, your family, or friends if you refuse to pay for sexual acts? If you refuse to provide sexual acts? Has anyone ever taken suggestive photos of you to post on the internet? The most important thing in this situation is remembering to take time to build rapport with Jasmine and inform her of your reporting obligations. Just abruptly beginning a conversation about commercial sex absolutely is going to inhibit her comfort with you, talking to you as a medical provider about her experience and concerns. So spending some time with her, getting to know her, developing that rapport with her, building a connection with her on whatever level you feel like you can is going to be absolutely imperative to getting Jasmine to open up and recognize that you're there to help her. So both sex and labor trafficking victims often do face a high level of trauma and experience repeated traumatic events, which can have various physical and cognitive ramifications for trafficking survivors. Medical professionals should keep these effects in mind when offering medical help to a patient who is also a victim of human trafficking. Trauma can affect victims in the following ways. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So like other survivors of traumatic events, many trafficked victims suffer from PTSD, and those symptoms most commonly associated with victims of trafficking are going to be things like recurrent thoughts and memories of terrifying events, feeling as though the event is happening again. They may have recurrent nightmares, feeling emotionally detached or withdrawn, an inability to feel emotion entirely, being jumpy or easily startled, an inability to concentrate, difficulty sleeping, feeling constantly on guard, feeling irritable, having outbursts of anger, avoidance of activities that might remind them of the traumatic event, disinterest in daily activities, feeling hopeless, like they don't have a future, avoiding thoughts or feelings associated with a traumatic or hurtful event, any sudden or emotional physical reaction when reminded of the most hurtful or traumatic events. They may even have a memory disruption, so traumatic events affect the way your brain encodes memory, and that can disrupt the ability of trafficking victims to recount experiences of traumatic events accurately. This means trafficking victims may even find themselves unable to recount a coherent narrative of their trafficking experience. They may only be able to recall disconnected flashes of memory in bits and pieces, or they may find that memories of the traumatic event are triggered by sensory information, so things like smells and sounds. They may even, and most likely, have experienced trauma bonding, which is incredibly common amongst sex trafficking victims. In many trafficking cases, victims have exhibited commonly known behaviors of trauma bonding, such as, or for example, like Stockholm Syndrome. It is due to the violence and the psychological abuse. The coercion employed by these traffickers may lead a victim to experience a very deep connection with the trafficker, or the victims may bond together during a trafficking situation. So victims who have formed trauma bonds with their trafficker, they may demonstrate loyalty and concern for their trafficker. They may be unwilling to report or testify against them. They may even return to their trafficker after having previously decided to leave the situation. So understanding these dynamics will be helpful if you encounter trafficking victims who may be uncooperative in your attempts to offer assistance. All right, so next we're going to discuss promising practices for responding to trafficking situations once you believe you have encountered a victim of human trafficking. It's important to address the immediate needs of a patient, but healthcare institutions should also plan ahead for the likelihood of encountering a trafficking victim. So hospitals, clinics, other providers should all build internal protocols for how staff should respond in suspected human trafficking situations. All those protocols should include how and to whom reports are made, and identify local services providers who can serve local service providers who can serve trafficking victims. In many ways, protocols for human trafficking may be similar to protocols or procedures that are already in place for related crimes, such as domestic violence or child abuse. Some healthcare institutions have also found it useful to incorporate human trafficking into existing protocol structures, Others have developed tailored policies, and it just really depends on what your facility finds is going to be the most useful for them. If the resources are available, it might be very beneficial to designate a trauma-informed interviewer who can ask questions beyond the initial screening process. Having a designated interviewer would be especially effective if physicians are too busy to take the necessary time to develop trust and or build rapport with a patient. Finally, training for all staff should accompany the implementation of any new protocol related to human trafficking. You certainly want to make sure that you're being consistent. All right. If you encounter a patient presenting with several red flags for human trafficking, you may want to obtain more information about his or her situation by asking a few key assessment questions. This is going to enable you to provide useful options to the patient and tailor referrals to the patient's needs and wishes. The goal of these questions is not necessarily disclosure or rescue, but the goal should be to ensure that the patient feels safe. Should he or she wish to disclose any information that will help you identify trafficking indicators and assist them. Again, it is critical to build rapport and trust. I can't say that enough with that patient. So please consider easing into the conversation by beginning with neutral questions. Examples of some key questions to ask may include, have you had any injuries that you're worried about? Are you worried about any recent sexual activity, such as STD risk or pregnancy? When was the last time you had a meal? Where do you sleep? Are you able to keep the earnings you make, or does someone take all or part of your earnings? When was the last time you were paid? So just very, very basic, gentle questions. Initial assessments should be conducted individually with a patient in a safe location. As traffickers may accompany victims for medical appointments, it's going to be important to not ask sensitive questions of a patient in front of a potential trafficker. Use normal activities like going for an x-ray or an exam. Find a safe place to speak privately with the patient. If that patient requires interpreting services, always use a professional interpreter. Do not rely on the individual who accompanies the patient. They may have ties to the trafficking situation, or they may be pressured to disclose your conversation to others, plus you have no idea that they are translating appropriately. Please. Most facilities have this protocol in place anyway to avoid this happening, but use your professional translator services. The goal of an initial assessment is to assess the current situation in order to determine next steps, not simply disclosure. So be sure to take the time to build rapport and trust rather than simply treating it as another screening. They deserve that from you. So again, remember that some victims of trafficking may not recognize that they are a victim. They don't self-identify as a victim of trafficking, so they may not be willing to report their situation. You have an opportunity to build trust with the patient and give them the information that they need should they be ready to seek assistance in the future. The NHTRC can assist in conducting an assessment with the patient and determine next steps. So be sure that you seek more information about victim identification and potential assessment questions to use by checking out the medical assessment tool, What to Look For During a Medical Exam, NHTRC Comprehensive Assessment. Adopt a victim-centered approach when working with patients who may be victims of trafficking. Here are 6 recommendations for victim-centered interactions with a potentially trafficked person. Meet the basic needs. Identify and meet basic needs such as food, water, clothing, and shelter first. Include the victim in identifying those immediate needs. Provide them with options. So don't just assume that you're going to jump in there and do that for them. The more you include them in those things, the more they trust you, and the more they know that you really care about their needs and their desires. Reassure the potential victim. You're there to help and not to arrest, punish, judge. Meet them on his or her terms. Meet that person where they are. Always meet them where they are. Build trust and rapport. Expect trust to take time. It absolutely will. So demonstrate consistent, unconditional care. Do not dispute or question facts reported or comment on the victim's motivation. Do not make promises you may not be able to keep. Be non-judgmental and reaffirm the victim's strengths. Be conscious of language. Ask open-ended questions, and always keep in mind that many victims, again, do not self-identify as trafficking victims. Mirror the language the victim uses as best you can. Avoid derogatory terms. Remain sensitive to power dynamics, understanding that they see you in a position of authority. So be sensitive to that. One-on-one interactions are going to be ideal, especially because a trafficker may insist on being present to control what a victim is going to say. Ensure the patient knows that medical treatment is not conditioned on disclosure. You're going to take great care of them no matter what. Don't make them think that this is a tit for tat. That's not what it's about. Avoid re-traumatization. Recognize the symptoms of trauma and coping mechanisms. Make the interaction conversational rather than an interrogation riddled with questions. If you believe the patient with whom you're working with may be a victim of trafficking, it can be useful to give them the NHTRC number or assist them in calling the hotline. In situations of immediate life-threatening danger, follow all relevant mandatory reporting and institutional policies for reporting to law enforcement. Whenever possible, make an effort to partner with the patient in the decision to involve law enforcement. The NHTRC is a national 24-hour anti-trafficking hotline and resource center serving the United States and U.S. territories. And they do provide human trafficking victims and survivors with access to critical support and services to get help and to stay safe. They equip anti-trafficking community with the tools to effectively combat all forms of human trafficking. They also offer a confidential crisis and tip line as well, training and technical assistance, service referrals to local providers across the country, information regarding human trafficking data and trends. They assist in conducting a safety check, trafficking screening with potential victims, determining next steps, facilitating a report to specialized law enforcement who are trained in human trafficking, and identifying local service provider referrals specific to the patient's needs. So that hotline can absolutely give you pretty much anything you need should you be at a loss for what to do next. And all communications with them are confidential unless the caller provides permission to be connected with law enforcement or a service provider. If the caller threatens harm to self or others, or if they're in immediate danger or experience a life-threatening emergency. So when calling the NHTRC, medical professionals should keep in mind any relevant HIPAA or confidentiality restrictions. Medical providers need not provide any confidential information to the NHTRC in order to seek assistance or facilitate service referrals. Whenever possible, their endeavors to speak directly with victims to discuss the various reporting and referral options and receive explicit consent to make and report or give referrals on his or her behalf. The consent from a victim and the safety of any individuals involved are the most important factors that they consider when weighing whether or not to make a report to law enforcement. Legal requirements requiring mandatory reporting of human trafficking may differ from state to state, and situations may require mandatory reporting under related statutes, even if the situation is not human trafficking, so such as child abuse or domestic violence. Be sure to refer to your local or state requirements regarding mandatory reporting. Most of us know what our state's mandatory reporting is, especially for those of us that are licensed in certain venues of healthcare. While contacting the NHTRC will not fulfill mandatory reporting requirements, they can facilitate a report to specialized law enforcement trained to handle human trafficking cases. Victims of trafficking may have diverse service needs. Some victims may need basic services such as housing, clothing, food, medical care, social support, case management. Please don't forget mental health services. Every one of them are going to need mental health services. Remember, we talked about PTSD, trauma bonding. Those things are very real. Legal advocacy, protection. There may be many other service providers who are serving this patient. If it's possible, establish relationships with these service providers in order to streamline future referral processes. Coordinating care, appointment schedules, and referrals will help to ensure that victims can receive the help they need as quickly and efficiently as possible. Okay, we hope that you found this presentation useful. For more information about human trafficking for healthcare professionals, visit the following websites and resources. Those are all listed for you here. We would like to give a special thank you to the following individuals for sharing their expertise. And those are all listed for you here as well. We also would like to know what you thought about this training. We do appreciate your feedback. Please give us your thoughts by clicking on the link and take this 2-minute survey for us.